Welcome to Bridging the Gap, a commentary on discrimination, marginalization, race, and identity at Duke. This is part 2 in our discrimination episode. Today, we present discrimination as a nuanced issue manifesting across identities. It is felt along racial lines, gender lines, and across nationalities. There is no one perpetrator. There is no cookie-cutter mold for those experiencing discrimination. It is multifaceted and as diverse as the students dealing with it. First, let's start with our land acknowledgement. We here at Bridging the Gap want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that the Greater University occupies as the ancestral lands of the Shakori, Ino, and Catawba Indian peoples. We hope you all will take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral owners of the land you currently stand on. Last time we hit you with a lot of facts. It was a lot of me talking. So today we're going to focus on the student story. What does the Duke community have to say about the multidimensional nature of discrimination? Let's start with Dr. Gaither, Duke Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience, focusing on interracial interactions and social identity. She talks about the development of racial identity and the role college plays in that identity.
Race is a completely socially constructed concept and set of categories in our society, and we learn about race very early on within development. So by the ages of 5 to 6 is when we already know most kids have some form of a racial or an ethnic identity. That's when it starts to become important to you, and that continues to shift across your development. And what I think is really important about college, particularly a school like Duke, is a 4-year university where most students are leaving home for the first time, right? There's very few students at Duke who are actually from Durham. So they're leaving their homes, they're leaving their families, they're leaving all of their closest friends, and all of you are forced to find new social connections that first year of college. That's one reason why at Duke they really like the East Campus experience, because it's a way to give all first-year students a common identity of living in a common space. So this is a really important identity period because it's the first time for a lot of students when you are forced to live by yourselves. And oftentimes you're exposed to people from different backgrounds and different identities and different experiences that maybe you never even knew that you had in common with someone else. Many students don't even realize they can't identify as X until they get to a college environment that gives them more freedom to do so. So I do think college is a prime time for these conversations to happen. But we also need everyone on both sides of these conversations to be open and willing to have these conversations at the same time.
Dr. Gaither touches on the important topic for today, conversations, talking. This is the one consistent solution our Duke community has come to in how to combat the internal prejudices many students, faculty, and staff likely come to campus with. So, let's discuss the roadblocks to conversation. Number 1, it has to be mutual. I cannot force conversation on you if you're not willing to speak with me, to learn about me, or to interact with me, right? Pakistani sophomore Aisham Khan talks about a willingness to enter spaces and the difficulty of interracial engagement when people are unwilling to meet you halfway.
So I just think it's Duke as an institution, for me, is not only very conservative, because we all know that it is, but it's a very polarized place. And it's polarized in that, I think anyone who's a little bit left, or not a rich white person, obviously that kind of person would need community. And sometimes I think our communities form as a response to racism and out of fear rather than, sort of a true solidarity or love. And so I think, when your communities are based on fear, sometimes being, I don't want to say extreme, but I guess what I mean is being very authoritative on what isn't right. It's just a reaction to the very real racism that we face. So I think I think Duke is a very divided place for me. And I think in almost every space, you're you finding community is contingent upon you following a script. Obviously, that's not to say like I have really good friends and, you know, I'm having a good time this semester. But I think like broadly, those are just like really big frustrations I have with Duke. I think it's hard for me to say what a solution to racial or identity-based segregation might be, because even though I've said all the things I've said, obviously, like, I've experienced, you know, it's the strangest thing. Like, at times when I've been in a group or walked up to a group of like white people or had to interact with them for whatever reason, they will not like want to look at me, like make eye contact even. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how to describe it. I might just be crazy, but I've had that. And especially, you know, like with white women and white women in feminist spaces where I've felt just, it's the look. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but it's a real thing.
I recall conversations with my mom about my own experiences at Duke. She has said that as a Black person or as a person of color, you are always expected to do the giving. White people don't feel like they have to give in a situation. Black people always feel uncomfortable. They always have to get over being uncomfortable. But if a white person feels uncomfortable, then they'll throw a fit. They don't feel like they have to deal with it. Some would call that white privilege. But the goal here isn't to shame the white man. This is very much an oversimplification, a generalization, and a stereotyping of white people. And that is not what this podcast aims to do. Let us acknowledge for a moment some facts. The look is a real thing. P&G even made a commercial about it. That look of discomfort, disdain even, at seeing a BIPOC individual in a place where you wouldn't expect to see them. This is a very real experience. Let's acknowledge that in recent years, we've been seeing a lot of Karen videos. White women calling the cops on Black kids. White men calling the cops on Black women. White people calling the cops on people of color for not being where they should be. Aisham just told us about her experience with the look when entering some of these white spaces. Last week, Toby Akinyelu told us he has been questioned at Duke and off campus for being somewhere he doesn't belong. I can go back and recall my own negative interracial experiences, that look of discomfort, the unwillingness to look me in the eye, a feeling of being unsafe. It feels like this is the biggest barrier to these mutual interracial interactions. They are not universal. This is not every white person, but they happen often enough to detect a pattern. And they make it difficult to bridge the interracial gap. The second part of this mutual interaction is the mental and emotional fatigue of education. Because in order to get to a point of interracial collaboration, we must treat our conversations as education. Cynthia Dong discusses the impact of having conversations with our white peers in educating them on BIPOC communities.
It's like hard to explain to a white person like how being a person of color is, you know, emotionally traumatizing sometimes, because like as you're explaining it, as you're educating them, to them it's almost a thought experiment. To them it's like a game almost, because they don't experience it. It's just like a philosophical debate for them. But it's exhausting for me to have to justify like why I deserve to be treated just as well as they do, why I deserve to be treated like a person, why I'm not lesser because I'm not white. It's like, I think that's something that I've realized as of late, like the amount of emotional trauma that POC go through in trying to educate their white peers is like, it's not something that people talk about as much. I think it's being talked about more, but I do think it's like an aspect at Duke. Like, I think also that's a very Duke thing is like a lot of white peers, they see these like, you know, political issues as like a thought experiment, you know? And for me, it's like, I am genuinely trying to justify to you, like, it feels like I'm justifying to you why I deserve like the same rights as you do. And that's like I think Duke people need to understand that, like, you know, for some people it is personal. It is like very emotional. It's not like this logic game, right? Like you can't just remove all the humanity from like these political issues because you were like really causing people to question their identity and their worth. And I feel like that's something at Duke that I have experienced when I talk about these issues.
If people recall, when the protests popped off in late May, there was a push by companies, human resource departments, etc., to check in on employees of color. I remember over the summer, Priska Neely, a reporter and podcaster covering issues of race in the United States, gave a presentation to a small group of aspiring reporters about her work. She talked about how a lot of BIPOC individuals were suddenly getting texts, DMs, emails from white coworkers and old friends checking in, asking if they needed to talk about anything, all of that. Apparently, people like Priska were getting bombarded with the texts, an overwhelming barrage of messages from people who didn't seem to care about her emotional well-being until now, and who were each asking for a chunk of her time to learn a bit more about how they could be better and more inclusive and more considerate. Priska wrote in an article about it, "I don't need your check-in texts. Whatever you think I might be feeling because of the news right now, it's not new for me this week." I'll just say 10 out of 10, I would recommend reading that. The gist of the article, and many like it, which have come out since the start of the Black Lives Matter protests this summer, is that receiving these messages is exhausting, that many people were reaching out with superficial support and no way to actually provide support should their BIPOC friend or coworker actually need a shoulder to cry on, and that having these conversations all the time is re-traumatizing and unfair. I say all of this because getting back to the need for a mutual conversation, on one side, at times, sits someone who is unwilling to talk. On the other side, sits an emotionally drained individual just trying to go about their lives. Should it be the responsibility of BIPOC individuals to educate their white peers? Let's hear from Dr. Gaither on the issue.
One perspective I like to encourage students to think about is, until you know what someone else is going through because of their background, let's say it's because of their race or ethnicity, there's no way that they could ever understand what it's like to be a minority if they're a white student unless someone takes the time to explain that to them. So if you're not willing to have those conversations with someone else on campus to help a student learn about your culture or your background on the forms of discrimination you have faced on our own campus, then I don't know who else would be willing to have those conversations. And it's that lack of conversation, that lack of education that leads to, again, why these cross-race interactions always end up going so poorly, is because we just have no practice and have no knowledge about each other's experiences.
Up until this point, discrimination has come up in the context of the cis white man as the single perpetrator or oppressor. But racism and discrimination hit people in all aspects of their life and across identities.
There's a big push of discussions on campus surrounding intersectionality and having multiple identities. And I think a lot of the questions about discrimination experiences on campus are often focused only on one identity at a time, when a lot of our students are actually facing discrimination from multiple angles. And so being able to process those forms of discrimination when they're not targeting just one aspect of yourself, but multiple parts of yourselves, I think is something that we don't think about enough. I know Black women often are looked over in comparison to Black male experiences on our campus and obviously in society at large. So I think that these issues across the last 6 months with the Black Lives Matter movement coming more to the forefront, it's invigorated a lot of students to start reconsidering the race relations they have with their friends, the race relations they have on this campus. I think this generation of undergraduates seem very social justice oriented and motivated in my view, which is amazing to see. But it's still making sure that everyone understands the different experiences that each individual person is having on our campus. That's really key for us in being able to foster a more inclusive community and a more supportive community.
Cynthia discusses racism and colorism in the Asian community.
I think that both communities have this standard, right? White people, I think a lot of people of color are pretty aware of that standard because a lot of us have spent a long part of our lives trying to fit in. But even within the Asian American community, there are these kind of niches you're supposed to fit into, right? And I do think it plays into this whole idea of the stereotypes we're held to. You're supposed to be smart, you're supposed to be like this, you're supposed to be that. I think as a woman and as an Asian, I have to fight 2 times, 3 times as hard to get any recognition for my work, right? Because like one hand, I feel like as an Asian, people almost expect you to have to achieve at a certain level for you to be noticed. There's like a really great book called Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling, which I think talks about this concept a lot, where Asians are kind of like they're used as like this gold standard for other racial minorities. But on the flip side of that, it's like if you want to be noticed as an Asian, you do have to work like 2 times as hard, right? And then like as someone who's bi, like it's just weird for me because I've never really fit into the LGBT community anywhere here or at Duke or like anywhere else, just because I don't know, there's almost this idea of like, oh, you have to be a good gay or like a good bisexual to like be in the LGBTQ community. I don't know. It's like weird because it's not like a defining part of my identity. Well, I mean, it is, but it's not like something I really play up a lot. But because of that, I think people almost want to say I'm not like good, like gay enough to be in the LGBTQ community, or like I'm not like as forward about my identity, so I don't have a place there. I don't know. The Asian community can be very racist and very discriminatory towards other races. There's definitely a lot of colorism within the Asian community, which I don't think is something the Asian community likes to talk about. So I think a lot of people aren't aware of it. But like even in China, when I go back to China, Asian people like worship whiteness. They like they're like, they stay out of the sun, so their skin stays pale. Even on advertisements, there's like white people. I remember when I was younger, I asked my mom, like, why are there white people? This is Asia. And she was like, no, they're like pretty and they look exotic, right? But as someone, like I have a bit darker skin for an Asian. Whenever I go back, like I've heard, oh, you're so pretty, you'd be even prettier if you were whiter. Like people are just so blatantly racist towards like Black people, especially in the Asian community. They automatically assume like Black people are violent or like dirty or like criminals, which obviously is not true. Like when I was having discussions with my mom about like what was happening in America, she was like, no, like this is just their culture. Like this is just, I was like, you can't say that. Like anyone in their situation would act that way. Like anyone who had been oppressed for that long, was been subjected to those conditions for that long, would be angry, would like react that way. You can't just, force this idea onto this whole group of people. That's just not fair.
From an international perspective, Aisham expressed concerns about the treatment of thought and opinion in woke BIPOC spaces. Discrimination, tokenism, and marginalization are still propagated in BIPOC spaces and upon other BIPOC identifying individuals.
I think, my with white people, it's always been either they say something silly and dumb in class, and so I want immediately to counter that. It's been like small incidents of, annoying statements. Other than that, I think the things that really bug me are not white people, because I don't expect anything from white people. I think it's not discriminatory per se, but the reluctance of many of my BIPOC peers to acknowledge that I have differences in opinion is what has, sort of hurt my feelings, for lack of a better word.
In the fight for equality, the concept of are you enough comes into play. In a lot of BIPOC spaces, to go against the script, as Aisham would call it, means getting pushed out of the conversation. There are certain standards to follow. Am I Black enough? Am I woke enough? Am I the right type? In the Black community, some would call that the Black police. Is what you're saying in line with the movement? If it's not, then you're not enough, and you're a traitor to the cause. This idea of being enough hits on a personal level. I remember coming to Duke and not quite feeling like enough for the Black community here. And then when the time came and I dealt with my own unfortunate run-ins with interracial discrimination, I didn't really have a support system. It was isolating. It is this sort of internal discrimination that also needs talking through at Duke, and that doesn't get quite enough attention in conversations about race and marginalization. So, what can the university do better? MFA student Aaliyah Baker discusses one push Duke has made to reckon with its controversial past in the form of a bus tour offered to new Duke faculty that she had the opportunity to sit in on when she arrived last year. This tour took her around campus and around Durham, talking about the ways in which BIPOC individuals helped build the Duke-Durham community.
In my graduate experience, I got to go on this tour called Context and Connections, which is primarily for like new faculty members to really understand the origin of Durham, the fact that, you know, the Duke family also enslaved folks, and just kind of like that history of Duke that I think isn't often articulated or talked about. And the ways that Duke has kind of brought some, you know, good things to the city of Durham, but also been a part of sort of displacing a lot of folks in the Black community that surrounds the university. So there's like a reckoning that needs to happen there. And I'm glad that those conversations are happening a little bit more. And I actually think that tour that I go on that like gave me all of this history about Durham and about Duke and their relationship together really is something that like all students should be exposed to. It just was so eye-opening to me to learn about all of the, I mean, I kind of, you know this, but I didn't know like names and faces of people who kind of had built Duke and built Durham, and specifically the Black folks, and sort of the ways that the university has kind of participated in the politics of the city. And I think that just even as a grad student, learning that now really opened my eyes and kind of completely sort of changed my perspective on the university and that Duke-Durham relationship. And I always am saying, how is the way that we can get every single undergrad who steps foot on Duke's campus to really understand the history of the place that they're in? And it's more than, you know, just like Cameron and camping out, right? Like there's so much other history that really is underneath what's happening at Duke, and that everyone I think should understand to really, I guess, be a better sort of like citizen to Durham while you're in the area.
In line with what Aaliyah has said, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge displacement and gentrification in Durham. Displacement in Durham is nothing new. As the city continues to grow, gentrification has been pushing lower-income renters and homeowners, predominantly people of color, out of their homes for years. Most recently, the 9th Street Journal reported on the fight in Bragtown, one of Durham's oldest historically Black neighborhoods. Formed after the Civil War, Bragtown was settled by formerly enslaved men and women and transformed into a center for Black culture in the area. Now, the neighborhood is one of the last vestiges of the Black and brown community. Durham is an ever-developing city, housing Duke as a top global institution. This is attracting developers and new, wealthier residents, and pushing out the communities who helped build the city up. Aaliyah hopes that this tour, an opportunity to not only get undergraduates off campus, but to give them insight into the contentious racial history of their community, will be offered more widely with time and help students respect the situation of the marginalized communities located not far off of campus. Aside from educating the student body on the racist history of the institution, it's also about making room for more in-depth, mutual, open conversations, especially in response to student self-segregation and tribalism.
I think as far as segregation goes, I think we just have to have the grit to have to face a little bit of judgment or prejudice or opposition. I don't know what you would call it. You know, like it's really difficult to put in that energy, but I think ultimately that's what I thought college was going to be about. I anticipated coming to Duke having more debates with people that are very different from me, but in a respectful way. And the only times that I've ever disagreed with someone, it's been like bad, you know, where they call me a snowflake, I call them racist. And, you know, even though most of the time they were racist, but, you know, I think it's having the ability and the capacity and the maturity to be able to do that. that's what we should focus on ultimately. I think we need to stop avoiding or stop being so avoidant of difficult, nuanced conversations where our beliefs will be challenged. I think the problem is approaching it as education, both sides. It's teaching someone. And I think it's just like conversation is what I have not seen. And it is difficult because, like you said, like white people are very uncomfortable with me. And that's with like me, like not being the most Muslim looking person on earth. And so, yeah, it's hard. What I think ultimately the thing that I want from Duke and Duke students, and the thing that I think is most lacking is we always frame our identities around like our oppression, and obviously given all the things that have happened to me because of where I come from, oppression is definitely it definitely is a huge part of how my experience is going to be if, I choose to stay in America. But I think it's that my identity, whichever one it is, not that I like to dice them up separately, is never celebrated. It's just validated. You know what I mean? We are marginalized and we need to stick together. And while that's true and that's really brave, I'd like to dream of, spaces that aren't protective of us, but that are just celebratory. Can I talk about this like Muslim poet and not be asked to interpret it from a post-colonial perspective or a critical race-based perspective, so it's typecasting me as an oppressed person. Yes, I have experienced oppression and I cannot deny that. But when I'm invited to an activist space and it's Aisha, we wanted you here because you're marginalized, I'm like, all right. I didn't expect to be tokenized by like other people of color, but here we are. And so that's, I guess, my dying wish for Duke University and the world.
I do think like everyone should be more open to hearing any kind of idea. Like, just like my experience as growing up in a community where honestly a lot of people were very racist. I think people need to recognize like people who say racist things, a lot of times they aren't bad people. They're just genuinely ignorant, and we have to be patient with them. And there are obviously some things we should not allow to be said in our spaces just because it's like detrimental to the, like it just encourages like a environment of violence almost. But I think there are some things where it's like, we should allow people to say bad things. Like we should allow people to say, racist things. We just need to like allow each other to say things that we don't agree with, because I think no matter how woke you are, all of us are a little bit racist. All of us are a little bit like could be better. And I think by not allowing people to, be in a process of growth is not great for that goal.
Dr. Gaither's research has also proven that there is a need for Duke to take action. It's not just up to students. There are clear steps the university can take to make sure students are interacting and learning from each other. She discussed with us Duke's move to random roommates for all first years as one example.
So the work at Duke is still underway, but I can tell you some of the published work I've done before that's very related, and some of the preliminary findings at Duke During grad school, I got my PhD at Tufts University, which is another predominantly white university in the Boston area. And we published work there that shows that for white first-year college students, if you are randomly paired to live with someone from another racial background, so living with either a Black, Latino, or Asian roommate, that experience, as long as it's positive, by the end of your freshman year, when I bring you to the lab to meet a Black student you've never met before, that interaction goes way better. You make more positive eye contact. The Black student also feels much more comfortable in that interaction, which is really important to me in my work, is to make sure we're centering on how these experiences are shaping hopefully more positive outcomes for students of color. And so really this was some of the first evidence to show that living with someone from another racial background can positively influence how at least white students are seeing cross-race interactions. At Duke, we're actually focusing on both white and minority students, and we're finding the same types of effects so far. We're showing that if you have a randomized roommate and you live with someone from another racial background, whether you're a racial or ethnic minority student or a white student, by the end of your freshman year, your friend network is much more racially and ethnically diverse. You also think much more flexibly about what is considered diversity in your life. You're much more willing and open to also have difficult conversations about diversity issues on campus. So to me, this is really positive news for Duke's campus, that a simple policy change, such as randomizing roommates just for the first year of college, right? After that, all students can choose who they want to live with. But that first year is such an important identity development period that it seems to be making the whole campus more inclusive for all students, regardless of their background.
Like always, we want to wrap up with a poem for you all. This is one of my personal favorites, a call for self-love and self-confidence from the late Maya Angelou. This is Still I Rise.
You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom just 'cause I walk as if I have oil wells pumping in my living room? Just like suns and like moons, with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. Does my sassiness upset you? Don't take it so hard just 'cause I laugh. As if I have gold mines digging in my own backyard. You can shoot me with your words. You can cut me with your lies. You can kill me with your hatefulness. But just like life, I'll rise. Does my sexiness offend you? Oh, does it come as a surprise that I dance as if I have diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And so, naturally, there I go rising.
Thank you so much for joining us again today. Please stay safe out there. Be well, wear a mask, and we look forward to continuing these deep dives into Duke's diverse and beautiful communities next time.